Good evening and welcome to our webinar, Myanmar After the Coup. My name is Chris Grimes and I'm the executive editor at Nikkei Asia, and I'm honored to have this distinguished panel of Myanmar experts with me this evening. Allow me to introduce them. We have Thompson Chow, a reporter based in Myanmar who's been contributing some excellent work to Nikkei Asia, and he's also the former business editor at the Myanmar Times. He's in Myanmar right now and having a bit of a connection problem, but we expect him shortly. Gwen Robinson is the editor-at-large at Nikkei Asia, and she's literally been working night and day in the 10 days since the coup and doing just amazing work for us. Next, we have Tony Davis, who's a security analyst at Jane's Information Group and an expert on Myanmar's military and ethnic conflict in the country. And finally, we have Koi Chongkitavorn, who is a senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies and a longtime journalist in Myanmar and Bangkok. So I think let's actually start with Gwen while we're waiting for Thompson. Gwen, you've been following Myanmar for years, and I'd like, if you could, for you to back up and tell us what we know so far about the origins of this coup.
Right. Well, so far, and also just to update viewers who may not have seen recent images, one of the reasons Thompson is having a connection difficulty is it does seem like the junta, I won't call them the new government, the people in control have just taken down the internet, I believe. So there has been a cut right around the city, but up to now, as I think most people have, at least in the last week, tuned in either to social media or TV news and seen the incredible buildup of protests on the streets and actually spreading beyond the capital, Naypyidaw, and the main city, Yangon, to throughout the country, actually, even small towns and secondary and tertiary towns like Mandalay. Those protests began to get violent the last few days, and the military has issued warnings to people to stay off the streets. Actually, I think protesters are so determined that they are braving not just water cannon, but rubber bullets and some incidents yesterday of live fire, which has injured and possibly killed one and severely injured another protester. So that's the backdrop. What were the origins of this coup? I think that's a very big question and a lot of debate going round about it. As we all know, when Myanmar was taken over by the military last Monday, February the 1st at 3 a.m., the announcement later in the day from the military regime headed by the commander-in-chief announced that it was in response to what the military felt was grave fraud committed at the elections. Myanmar had the national election last November when Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy won a huge landslide, 83% or 82% of the popular vote. The military has clearly been enraged by that and disbelieving that, that this could be true. It shows the military mindset that they were actually, I think, genuinely convinced that not that they would win a landslide victory, but they were very convinced that they would get far more of a vote than they did. And to make it clear, the military doesn't run. It backs a party called the USDP that was in power for decades, really. It was, and that former ruling party was absolutely humiliated at the polls and ended up with 33 seats in a 476-seat parliament, upper house and lower house. So they were very humiliated, and the military demanded investigation. And I think probably one of the possible mistakes, if you like to call it, or maybe missteps, was that Aung San Suu Kyi and her government refused to acknowledge those grievances. Absurd as they may sound, I think that most of the protesters have accepted that the vote was legitimate and fair. However, none of these complaints were investigated, and this comes up again and again in military communication about the coup. They're constantly harping on, claiming that this regime now, this administration, the NLD, is illegitimate and stole the victory at the polls, whether you believe them or not, and whether, is it important about the real origins of the coup? People suspect that it actually was long planned. Now, this might seem like an academic question, but I think it's very critical to get some insight into how planned was this takeover in terms of being able to assess how deep are these ideas and policies and structures that we're now seeing being rolled out by the military. I mean, on day one, they announced a council, initially just a handful, 8 people. That's gone up now to 16. They appointed a cabinet within days. You're thinking, I don't think this happened overnight. And also some of their documentation and their legal justifications were obviously prepared. They weren't cooked up overnight. How long have they been planning? Well, you know, personally, I think that probably from day one, when Aung San Suu Kyi won a landslide victory in 2015, that's, 6 years ago, I think the military in some form or another thought that they would take back power in some way. And they have been dreaming of that moment probably since then. It actually came to a situation where they felt they could accommodate the NLD as long as Aung San Suu Kyi did not overstep the mark. And the reasons I could go on, but I'll keep this very short. They were very irked by her attempts to change the constitution, and to fill viewers in, the military controls 25% of parliament, and to change the constitution, you need a supermajority more than 75%. So the only way that she could ever become president, because she is barred from the presidency under this current constitution, would be to change it. There were other grievances along the way, including encroachment on their territory. She was very determined to make a model of her government, and one thing she couldn't touch was the military role. They also control 3 cabinet positions. So I think overall there was mounting frustration. The election result just added petrol on the whole thing, and it exploded. But my view is that at some point there was some very steady sabotage going on. Of course, she paid a high price in trying to possibly balance the military by going out to defend their brutal expulsion of the Rohingya Muslims in 2017 in Rakhine State, and went to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to actually defend. People say she defended the military. In fact, I think what she was defending was her government, because if she stood back and let the military try and defend themselves or say nothing, the military is ostensibly part of a government. You cannot be leader of a country and be completely separate from the military. So that's just a preamble to where I think the origins of the coup came. And I can see that Thompson is with us now. So I can see you eagerly anticipating. Congratulations, Thompson, for getting online.
Yes, well done, Thompson. Why don't we, thank you, Gwen. That was fascinating background on what led to the events of 10 days ago. Thompson, since you're on the ground there, it's been such a dramatic couple of weeks for you. Tell us what the mood is like right now, and what you're hearing from your contacts, maybe people who are protesting, but also people in business, and what they're thinking.
Thank you, Chris, and very happy to join the discussion today. I think I'll first start with saying that many businesses have been disrupted, partly not only because of the instability we've seen so far, but also because of the internet ban. I mean, just now I struggled to get online because the hotel informed me, I mean, their Wi-Fi got cut off again. And many business people, big and small, have been telling me the same thing, that with the pandemic, so much of the services and transactions have gone online. And now with the shutdown and the blocking of social media, a lot of business struggle to get to go on doing their business. I've been in some of the protests in Yangon over the past week. I think the mood is less exuberant than compared to Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. The protest I was in yesterday in downtown Yangon, and today where I dropped by a protest near Kendoji Lake, where many young people were gathering to join the protesting outside the UN office to ask for help from the UN. I think it's getting more serious, but it's still quite well disciplined. I mean, we see a lot of young people, but also older people and people with kids. We see LGBT activists, ethnic people. I think there is quite a division there, in the sense, I think back in Saturday and Sunday, I saw a lot of people in red. I mean, that's the color of the ruling party, the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party. But the protest I went to yesterday in downtown Yangon near Sula Pagoda, the color that dominated the protest was black. And people I talked to, the young people I've spoken to, say that's because many of them they're not here to endorse a particular individual or a party, but they're here to support the government, this democratic system. And I think black color allows them to stay away from endorsing anyone. I think the mood is really quite angry and indignant. I think the number of people you see in the streets are not indicative of the overall public mood. There are many other social movements going on now. I think one is the civil disobedience movement, with civil servants and public servants, doctors, engineers, reportedly tax officials as well, and a few other departments. I think that would be quite a problem for the new military government. The other indicator of how unpopular the new regime is would be at 8 p.m. every day, the ritual that people across the country, and particularly Yangon, will be banging their metal pots and pans in a Burmese tradition to drive away demons. And that is the way to show the disapproval of the coup and of the regime. And every day I've been in different townships, north and south, and even east near Tilawa, the Japanese special economic zone. And at times it would be so noisy, everyone would be taking their pans and metal pots out to make noise, that I couldn't even have a phone conversation properly because the background was so loud. So I think that speaks volumes about how angry people are. I think the numbers have reduced today and yesterday since the martial law, the curfew was declared on Monday. But it's very clearly that many people are not going to listen to the order not to gather in public. I mean, I'm here in a hotel right beside Kendoji Lake. There are so many young people outside protesting already.
That's fascinating detail. Thank you. And we'll hear some more of this in a minute. Tony, I'd like to turn to you. You've got great insight into the mind of the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military. And this may seem like a really basic question, but I wonder, Gwen talked about this a little bit, but why would they seize power like this, knowing that they risked more sanctions, more diplomatic isolation, possible serious economic damage? What were they thinking? What do you think?
Well, let me preface my remarks by saying that you were very generous in your introduction, saying that I have deep insights into the Myanmar military. The fact is, very, very few people outside of the Myanmar military have deep insights into their thinking. That said, I have been looking at how they operate for quite a few years now, so I'll make some remarks on that basis. I believe that what we need to understand when we look at the current crisis, and it is arguably the biggest crisis since 1988, what we need to understand is the mentality of the Tatmadaw as, first of all, a guardian of the nation. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But this is a force which sees itself as the guardian of a nation which has been confronted with a dilemma involving a deal which it thought it had made, which is clearly collapsing. Now, that deal came out of the elections of, well, it goes back to the Constitution of 2008 and the elections that followed in 2015. And the deal was essentially that the military would hold ultimate power while Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD would effectively run the economy and make sure the trains ran on time. What they realized after the last elections in November 2020 is that the ground was moving under them, and that her second term was going to be nothing like her first term. And there were hints of this already in her first term, attempts to change the constitution, which failed. However, given the massive landslide in November 2020, they realized that this situation was only going to get worse. And I think for that reason, there may have been subsidiary reasons, we can discuss them later if there's time, but essentially they realized that if they didn't move now, they would be turning over Myanmar and its destiny and its wealth to a civilian government that was not under their control. And that was something which they could simply not countenance. This raises the question, why do they feel the way they do? Why do they feel that they are the guardians of the nation? Almost, I'd almost go further than that. I'd say there is a sense within the Tatmadaw as an institution that they are somehow the soul of the nation. And if you want to understand the answer to that question, you really need to look at their history. And this is the history of a force which came out of World War II and within months of independence was confronted by two major enemies, Karen separatists and the Communist Party of Burma. And at that time, the Tatmadaw was, relatively speaking, a tiny force, 6 battalions. That was in 1949. And for the last 7 decades, the history of the Tatmadaw as an operational force has been fighting their way to control the country, to solidify the country, to make it a nation state against, not just started off with 2 enemies, it ended up, and today you can see a whole slew of them, an array of forces, mostly ethnic now, around the periphery, which confront them and challenge the nature of a modern nation state. When you have a history like that, you automatically feel that you are the people holding this together. And I think it's true to say, even today, even in the crisis that we're looking at, the Tatmadaw is ultimately the glue that holds this country together. If the Tatmadaw disappeared tomorrow, Myanmar would not just be a failed state, it would be a failed state on steroids. It would be Afghanistan would come to Southeast Asia. We really, it would be very difficult to contemplate. So within that context, I think we need to understand the Tatmadaw's psychology as guardians of the nation. And I'll make another point briefly about Tatmadaw psychology, because they're not only guardians of the nation as a fighting force, which has spilt blood and treasure for decades and continues to do so up until very, very recently, but in addition to that, they are, in a very real sense, a military caste. They're not just an army, they are a caste, and if you like, a caste apart, in the sense that in a multi-ethnic nation, they are overwhelmingly, rank and file, officer corps, overwhelmingly Bama from the majority community. Within that context, they see themselves as an elite. They are an elite within the Bama elite. And if you get into the officer corps and the thinking of the officer corps, which is obviously, these are the men that make decisions, you are dealing with, if you like, a band of brothers. All of the senior brass in the Tatmadaw has come up through combat formations. These are all guys who started off in their 20s or even late teens as combat soldiers and who worked their way up from divisional commander to regional commander to Bureau of Special Operations commanders in Naypyidaw, they've all come up, if you like, through the mud. And that sense of being a band of brothers gives them a status that they are an elite within an elite within an elite. And when you have that sense of superiority and of destiny, essentially you can do no wrong. You understand what is best for this country going forward. And very clearly what they see in the events of recent months is that a democratic transition, a full democratic transition to the NLD under Aung San Suu Kyi for the next 5 years would see their power and their prerogatives. Let's not gloss over the fact they have huge economic prerogatives and perks. All those come under threat. And that, at the end of the day, is something which, for both reasons of high state and reasons of grubby economics, they are not prepared to accept.
Thank you. That's amazing context. And so I think we'll turn now to Koh. You've written this week that ASEAN has faithfully stood behind Myanmar for years. So its neighbors have been very loyal, even when Myanmar was an international pariah. But you think this may not be the case any longer. Could you explain about what's going on with the neighbors and what's changed this time? And you're on mute.
Mute.
Thank you, Chris, for the question. I think ASEAN has suffered for too long, and this time around, I don't think ASEAN will do the same, because ASEAN has changed. ASEAN now has its charter, its own constitution, and most important, ASEAN has been becoming more integrated. As you can see, when the coup started, ASEAN chair came out with a statement on the same day. That was pretty fast, in the sense that ASEAN normally will take time. This time, ASEAN know exactly what to do. It came out with a 4-point statement urging dialogue and reconciliation. But the most important thing is that ASEAN mentioned ASEAN Charter, which respect the principle of democracy, rule of law, governance, and human rights. This is very important. So this time we have ASEAN Charter, and I think the military junta in Naypyidaw have to think very hard from now on how to engage ASEAN. Certainly, as a member of ASEAN, ASEAN member have to protect, but not in the protect blindly like in the past. This time it would take two to tango, and it's very important for the current military regime to engage with the ASEAN, particularly the ASEAN chair. One thing is very interesting, I think Gwen alluded to, that the setting up of the new team, one of the old hands was the former foreign minister, Wannamurn. He is an experienced diplomat, and he knows exactly what to do with ASEAN, because when Thailand staged a coup in May 2014, Thai sent a special envoy to report and update the situation to Wannamurn in Naypyidaw. So he knew exactly. So we have to wait from now on what will be the next step by Myanmar, how to engage ASEAN. But certainly this time, ASEAN would not defend. And Myanmar must make sure that whatever they said has to be comply with the ASEAN Charter and must be tangible and action oriented. And I think this will be the most interesting time, how to see ASEAN as a whole and ASEAN chair respond to crisis in Myanmar. And as you know, Myanmar is facing multiple issues of challenge. Number one, COVID-19. Number two, ASEAN already come out with a very good framework for economic recovery for all members. And number three, you have also the peace process. And number four, you have other related issue that would bring Burma into the full integration of ASEAN community.
Yes, and you raise a lot of issues there that we'll come back to. Gwen, you have your hand up, so.
Oh yeah, thanks. You saw it. Actually, I just wanted to, I mean, Kelly is the expert on ASEAN watching in this region, I think, but I just wanted to add to that because I wrote an opinion piece last week, actually calling for some kind of bridge building in terms of communication with the junta, and got a lot of pushback, and quite, rightly in some ways, that a lot of people are very angry, outraged, and they feel that by even talking to these generals, it's legitimizing them. My point is just, you hold your nose, whether it's not about legitimizing, but for example, if, as we all fear, if shooting starts tonight, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. If you see the military starting to mow down unarmed protesters, if there's terrible human rights violations, sorry, but you need to know who to call. You also, even for any country, even the US that has threatened sanctions, I think, there's concerns about getting your own citizens out of a country. There's concerns about your companies that are invested in the country. There are many, many reasons to establish communications lines, even for those very basic things. But on top of that, obviously, some people say there is no way for mediation, but I think also you need to build some kind of platform or groundwork. So if you do want to talk, if you do want to propose some kind of compromise, or if you even want to ask them, look, guys, would you reconsider and go away? You need some kind of channels. As Koei said, the new foreign minister, or the man who has taken the foreign affairs position, is the old one of the previous but one regime, and seen more as a moderate and has his old connections. But I think the interesting thing is to look at some of the models and footwork that is going on behind the scenes, including approaching Japan, India, Japan with very good links also to previous regimes, and India, and also, as Koei says, ASEAN, but also the UN Special Envoy, who's been working with all sides for a couple of years, and I believe has had some talk with the junta. That was my only point about engagement.
Interesting. I'm glad you raised the Japan point. Koei, you seems like you wanted to.
Yes, just a little bit more. I would like to add that there must be a coordination work between ASEAN and dialogue partner, United States, China, Japan, all these big countries that have stake in the futures of Myanmar. I agree with Gwen that you must have an efficient lines of communication. Now, I think there has been, but it's very informal between Naypyidaw and Brunei Darussalam, and also with Thailand. Min Aung Hlaing has wrote a personal letter to Thai Prime Minister, asking for the so-called quote and unquote physical and intellectual support. That is a very Buddhist term, that you have to help us wholeheartedly. And I think Thailand is willing to do so, given its own experience and political evolution. But ASEAN and Myanmar has to be in contact. And this time, United States with the new Biden administration, who opened up Myanmar 10 years ago, should be very careful in thinking of sanctions, because it will be less useful if America start out with that kind of measure. I think coordination among major dialogue partner is a very crucial, and you need ASEAN, particularly. I think the role of Thailand also very important, chairing 2,401 kilometers. Chris? Yes.
So I have a pair of questions here that are sort of linked, and I'd like to start with Tony and just ask, do you, it's a little unfair kind of crystal ball question, but do you think they're serious about when they say, can we take them at their word when they say that they plan to have elections in a year?
Well, what they said is the state of emergency would last for 1 year, and after that, at some unspecified point in the future, there would be elections. In that context, I do indeed take them at their word. I think they have no interest whatsoever in trying to hold down the country as a military junta for the indefinite future. So clearly, they didn't, I believe, and Gwen alluded to this earlier, long-term planning. I believe the coup was in the works at least, and since the elections results came out in November. So they've had plenty of time to think about this. And yes, I believe there is a long-term strategy which essentially hinges around two things. One is getting rid of the lady, Aung San Suu Kyi, either in terms of forcing her to leave the country or in terms of coming up with ridiculous charges that will then preclude her engaging in politics anymore. So to get rid of her, and then by amending their own constitution to rejig the game, to move the goalposts, to essentially do, and I don't know whether they specifically looked to Thailand in this context, but after the Thai coup in 2014, obviously the military were interested in breaking up Thai, the main opposition bloc. And it makes complete sense that the Tatmadaw would be looking to do the same thing. So they want to get rid of the lady, and they want to break up the NLD and have a system, quote, democratic, unquote, in which you have lots of little parties which don't challenge the big boy on the block.
Interesting. And that I was going to ask Gwen something that you just touched on, which is, Gwen, I know you've interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi a few times. I think I've edited some stories over the years based on those interviews. I was going to ask what you think her future is, and do you think she'll ever hold elected office again in the country?
Gee, you have a knack for asking crystal ball stories.
Sorry,
Chris. Well, I'll answer, and I'd also be interested, Thompson, since you're on the ground there. I mean, clearly everyone on the street believes she not only has a future, but she is the future. A lot of, but I've heard a lot of thinking and debate about whether actually this is a moment. She is 75. She has not been able to hold office. She is barred from office even under this current constitution. As Tony says, whatever happens next, and one hates to think, but clearly if there isn't the unthinkable, there's, the military is not ousted by some outside force, or if they are still there, definitely they will break up the NLD and what then? Aung San Suu Kyi is one of the biggest problems and has been for them ever since she came back to her country in 1988. It's been a huge problem. What can they do with her? Actually, even if things calmed down, if they go back to what they did before and keep her as a prisoner in her house, where she spent 15 years of 21 years and became a rallying point nationwide, just sitting there, not doing anything, silent, then that's a problem for them. What they are most likely to do, and they might do it tonight, is offer her release, free passage out, on the condition that she leaves the country. And everything I know about her and everything everyone knows about her would suggest that she will refuse that. She will not budge. And I'm very sure, because she's sacrificed her whole life for this, her leadership of Myanmar. There is no way she's going to go. So that is the only options they've got to deal with her. Even if they arranged an accident, as in bumped her off, I think that would just, the whole place would explode if anything happened to her. And they also know that, even though they can be totally ruthless, they've also got a lot of survival instinct. So, those are the options. And is there a compromise? Clearly, one of the things in the reconstructions that are coming out in the lead up, the days just before the coup, and there's been some excellent reporting by Nikkei, but also others, including a very good one on Reuters. It really made it clear that the military wanted was prepared for a power sharing arrangement. So that is the other option. But, you know, they might come to her and say, you know, not you, but perhaps some kind of power sharing with the NLD. There is no way she'd accept that either. So I think there's very limited options, and her future is, you know, I can't even imagine. It's either house arrest or having to leave the country.
Right. So I'd like to just open this up to anybody who wants to dive in. This is a very lively debate now about whether the coup will push Myanmar closer to China. And I've seen reasons why people think this will happen or it's inevitable, but other people say it's not. Who wants to dive in on this one? Is this Thompson? You're here. Tony?
Thompson has written a bit about this.
Thompson, go first.
Yeah. And you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, on the issue of China, I think just earlier today, some of the protesters I know are outside the Chinese embassy protesting. I think reputationally, the Chinese government and China as well have taken quite a hit following what a lot of protesters see as China defending the new junta regime in the UN. And I'm sure that China's aware of that. Just as we speak, 2 days ago, the environmental process, the EIA process for the Rakhine port, the Chinese CITIC-backed port, the tender just concluded. They were looking for someone to do the EIA process for them. So I think now there's also an additional question of how the new government, the junta regime, would deal with all these Chinese projects, which before was Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party were negotiating with them. And I think with the lack of legitimacy and the popularity here, for them to go ahead with any of the big Chinese big tickets, particularly the China-Myanmar economic corridor infrastructure projects, would add fuel to the fire.
That's
That's a
fascinating.
very good point. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Sure, Tony, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, picking up on what Thompson said about the economic corridor, CMEC, China-Myanmar economic corridor, I think everybody would agree that at this time, China's geostrategic focus, as far as Myanmar goes, is on CMEC. That is almost the be all and end all. They want to get CMEC done yesterday. And it's been clear, it was clear before Xi Jinping visited Naypyidaw in January of last year. It's been clear on a regular basis ever since. When are we going to move on this? When are we going to implement? Enough blueprints, enough talk, let's implement. So that is their focus. And if you look at the very awkward, difficult situation they confront today, it remains their focus. And to the extent that they don't want to, quote, blow it, unquote, they need, and the Chinese government clearly understands this, they need to wait and see how this is going to pan out in the coming days, weeks, and maybe a couple of months. If the military effectively controls the situation and we get into a period of possible sanctions, but essentially Myanmar politics moving forward, possibly along the lines I suggested earlier, then China will be dealing with the military. If, on the other hand, things spin out of control and break up in some shape or form, at that point, the Chinese will need to consider their whole approach to Myanmar. So right now, they must be in holding pattern. That seems to me to be self-evident.
And thank you. And Coe or Thompson, there's the historic relationship between China and the military leadership has been, it's a complicated story, isn't it? They aren't natural friends, and I don't know how far you want to go back, but I mean, it's could you just fill people in on how this relationship has worked?
Well, Chris, as you know, the Tatmadaw has a very good relation with China during the time of isolation, has been the assistant to China In fact, I would argue that now China has a huge dilemma because China would like to establish healthy relation with civilian government of Aung San Suu Kyi. And in fact, over the past 6 years, the relation has improved tremendously, both with civilian and Tatmadaw leader. Now with such a situation, I agree with Anthony that China is thinking very hard what would be the future direction. But given the complicated situation in Myanmar, I think there's a lot of option for China what to do. As you can notice, China policies toward Thailand during the coup, China often support the government in power, in full control, so that they can conduct diplomatic relation. So I think during this time, whether it's Myanmar-China relation, Myanmar-US relation, or with EU, the most important is to let diplomacy works. Otherwise, there will be no dialogue and the tensions would increase. So I think the next few days would be very crucial what the Tatmadaw would do to lay the groundwork, whatever we envisage.
Yeah, can I just add to that on China? I was talking just yesterday with an excellent, one of the leading, I think, experts on China-Myanmar relations, Dr. Yun Sun at Stimson Center. And she made the point, which I think is very good, that contrary to a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories that, you know, Wang Yi, that China's foreign minister, had visited a few weeks before the coup and had met with Min Aung Hlaing, which is true.
Right.
But the idea that, you know, China was backing the coup or that they even discussed it possibly is so I think so off beam. And indeed, the point is, had China known about the coup and that it was in the works, there is no way the foreign minister would go and publicly meet with the military commander. It just doesn't, you know, no one's stupid enough to do that. And the other point, I think, which I really agree with, is this is the last thing China wants. As Koei said, you know, very carefully cultivated relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi. And actually, you know, they haven't got everything they want, and they were forced to scale back the Chao Pyu Economic Zone project from many, you know, $10 billion or more down to, you know, just a fraction of that, just 15% of the initial value. But actually, they pretty well, you know, they've got quite a lot of what they want. And the military, meanwhile, is not 100% happy with China. Their relations are not great, and China hedges its bets by continuing to maintain links with some of the ethnic armed organizations.
And am I right that the whole democracy experiment that we've got kicked off because the military felt like they were being kicked around or bullied a little by China? There's the dam project and so forth. Is that right?
Well, indeed, that dam project, which is, what was it, $3.4 billion? It's a hell of a big dam, which was abruptly suspended, oddly, by the quasi-military government of quasi-civilian government that came in 2011, Thein Sein, and suspended it, which shocked everyone. But the latest report, they haven't pronounced on this, and Thompson, you might have some thoughts, but everyone is reporting that it's no doubt back on because it's just gone into mothballs. I mean, it's all there. There's even sort of some construction preparation there left over from before, but I'll leave that to maybe Thompson. Do you know the situation on Mid-Zone Dam in Kachin?
No, not really. I haven't heard of any updates there, but I think to loop back to what Gwen and Kavi said earlier, I think on Aung San Suu Kyi's approach on China, I haven't heard of anyone domestically attacking her approach. For example, the military-backed USDP. I think on issues like renegotiating the Jianghu port and whatnot, I think it will be very hard for the military government right now to completely change and greenlight the projects. But also they may not even want to. Most likely they will share the concerns that the NLD administration had regarding all these big Chinese proposals. Another quick point is what many local business people have been telling me. their main worry about what's going on, apart from the instability and the disruption, is that they're worried that when the sanctions come back, that would force Myanmar to go back to a position of a weaker position in relation to China, including the economy. And of course, local businesses who have had a good time in the last few years, striking deals with Western, Japanese, and European companies and partners, are now worried whether they would be losing a lot of options, and they're worried about going back to the days where China would be basically the only option for them.
Right.
Mm.
So you mentioned sanctions. That was going to be my next question. This is another one of these big questions out there about whether it's a good idea even for the U.S. I know the U.S. is weighing sanctions, but how effective would they be? Would they have any impact on how the military is feeling, or not? What do we think about this issue? Tony, you got a thought?
Yeah, I think, and other panelists have sort of alluded to this earlier, that sanctions are a very slippery path with no guarantees of good outcomes. We know that in terms of Myanmar historically. And what I suggested as the Tatmadaws mentality, this is not a mentality that is susceptible to sanctions or being pushed around. And I think if Western democracies want to go down that road, and it's a big if, but if they do, there has to be the sort of concerted approach between what I would call the Five Eyes, the Anglo-Saxon, US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, plus the Europeans. And if you can get a measure of concerted focus from a large, significant group like that, with others welcome to join, and many would not want to join, probably Japan, India, I'd be extremely surprised if they had any interest in joining. But if you can get that sort of central focus, then possibly they could have some impact. But frankly, I don't see the possibilities of that as particularly great.
Glenn, you have a...
Yeah, just very briefly, because I can see there's a lot of questions there. Yeah. We don't know. But just on sanctions, it's very interesting. It's a really crucial period. Someone said to me that you've probably got like a very, very narrow window right now to negotiate with a regime that has not yet mowed down innocent people in the streets wholesale. If they do that, I mean, it raises the bar incredibly on options particularly for the West. At the moment, believe it or not, even though they've been roughing up people on the street, I think that the military has been relatively restrained. They've only shot rubber bullets. They've only put a few people in hospital. They've been pretty nasty, beaten people up, but not the kind of bloodbath we saw in 88 or 2007. So at this point, there is a window. And this is precisely the time that the US and others are threatening sanctions, and the EU is trying to activate this new form of pseudo-Magnitsky Act. The problem is once, and sanctions is a whole other debate, and Cowie, you touched on it, and Thompson, you would know, it just ruined the country last time, and it did not make any difference to the behavior of the generals, and yet it really hit poor people and led to a lot more poverty and joblessness. The trouble is, if sanctions are used very soon, there is one possibility, and I wouldn't like to push it as any sort of prospect, but at this point, we saw some police crossing lines and joining protesters in recent days. Incredible. And at this point, you can see some of them are wavering or letting protesters through barricades. The military, as I know Tony will say, is absolutely in a different category, very trained, very hardened. However, actually the landslide of Aung San Suu Kyi's victory would indicate that there's a lot of military there whose mums, sisters, brothers, whatever, are either on the streets but voted for her. And I think this time the enormity of the feeling is so huge that I wouldn't say it's absolutely impossible that you might see some military turn. And the crucial moment would be if Min Aung Hlaing orders troops to fire on mass crowds using machine guns or whatever. It would only take a very small unit to turn, and you could see the whole thing turn. I was on EDSA in Manila in 1986 covering the Philippine People's Power Revolution, and you know, I saw it. It just turned like that. So, you know, that happened. If the West has then put on, the US system is such that even lifting the sanctions when they did in 2016 took years. It took years. It's a very lengthy process. So once you apply it, you better be pretty sure that, you know, it's you're going to keep them on for a while.
So
anyway.
Thompson has his hand up, and then Coey, if you.
Oh, thank you. No, I think the debate about the sanctions is also related to the debate here we have about the economy. I mean, most of the business I've spoken to think this is not Thein Sein 2.0. I know that there are some other local businessmen who are sort of quite buying into the idea that it's Thein Sein 2.0. If you look at one of the economic ministers they recruited, Win Shane was Thein Sein's finance minister. You have that kind of famous businesswoman who ran against Aung San Suu Kyi last year and didn't win any seats for the party. Of course, we have Aung Hlaing, a very well-respected and well-regarded reformist technocrat. But the fact that the whole environment is entirely different from Thein Sein's time. I mean, we're talking about sanctions now, a lot more hostile national investment environment. So I think the whole debate about sanctions reveals how different we are compared to Thein Sein's time, despite the fact that the cabinet could be quite similar in the people they appointed.
Interesting. And Coey, you.
Yes, I'd like to add, instead of sanction, I prefer to see coordinated pressure from ASEAN dialogue partner. That would be more important. I would like to recall during the cyclone Nargis, Myanmar adopt a very hardline attitude. No more outside assistance, no more ASEAN. But after Western countries voice large-scale sort of opposition, they will drop in the humanitarian aid by plane and many others reasons. Myanmar government at that time would listen. So it's a carrot and stick strategy, but you need well-coordinated pressure. United States, China, EU, and also neighboring country that share the border. That would be more effective. Then you will force the regimes in Myanmar to work together with the closest neighbor in this sense, ASEAN. Because Cyclone Nargis start out as a 100% no from Myanmar government, and then slowly introduce ASEAN, slowly introduce the international organization, then finally it become tripartite effort. So I think this is much better than sanctions. So coordinated pressure, systematic pressure, let Myanmar know what will happen next. And ASEAN also would be a very important, strongest link.
Interesting. Tony, did you want to make a point?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Gwen said. One I agree with and one I don't. The point that I agree with, and I think is worth underlining, is the very, very different approach to crowds of the military this time around. What we've seen is extremely, by Tatmadaw standards, this is remarkably restrained. And I think that's worth underscoring. And it may be coming to an end. The reports that Gwen referred to of a police unit in Kaya state essentially joining the crowds, that tells us something which we need to focus on quite a lot. But it's also worth noting in that respect that very much the same thing happened in Bangkok in 2010, when police units were notoriously unreliable. And at the end of the day, the military went in and did the job. And they did it in terms of breaking up the red shirt protest, they did it very well. So the point that I disagree with Gwen on is the idea that a unit of the Tatmadaw is suddenly going to defect or join the protesters, and that you're going to see division in the ranks. There is absolutely nothing in my assessment of where the Tatmadaw has been or where it is today that would suggest the sort of units committed to crowd dispersal are going to end up joining the protesters. I don't see that as a possibility.
Well, Tony, I posited it as an unlikely, but something that is not entirely impossible. There could be a few, and if there are a few, it could turn. However, you can say definitely there is a new generation, new generation of younger, senior, colonels and around that rank. There are some colonels that have actually had some Western, I wouldn't say military training per se, but cadets that have been notably in Japan, cadets that have been educated in Japanese military academy. And there are others, because when the West started to engage with Myanmar for 2011, it was that younger cohort that actually absorbed some of the early engagement. I'm not saying they've been on exercises, but they were even allowed to observe exercises, military exercises in Thailand. They have had some extraordinary amount of interaction with Western and some Asian military forces in recent years. That's all I was going to say. Anyway.
Well, where I would agree with you is that we are in totally uncharted waters. This situation today, tomorrow, in the coming days is incredibly fluid. Whether there is a cohort of liberal colonels waiting to burst forth and embrace democracy, I'm rather doubtful, but we can differ on that.
I never put it quite like that, but anyway, moving on.
So Gwen's right. We do have a number of really good questions from the audience here. So one is about sanctions, and someone's asking that for those who believe broad sanctions are ineffective, wouldn't the alternative of no sanctions send the wrong message and allow the regime to continue to enrich itself? Thompson, you're raising your hand.
Well, a quick response, being based in Yangon, is that some of the local business people and protesters I've spoken to, they want targeted sanctions against the military individually, but they do not want broad economic sanctions because they believe it doesn't work, it hurts the wrong people. I think we saw a very similar debate over the EU's EBA, tariff-free access debate 2 years ago. I think the more tricky question is in the debate here is how far they should go in sanctioning military economic entities. And given how active the entities are in some of the sectors of the economy, how would they deal with it and the impact on employment and on the economic growth overall?
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just add, I am not saying no. I think the word sanction is very, very broadly applied. I think these days the terminology are things like blanket sanctions, targeted sanctions, which are generally the individual and aimed at specific company, specific person, and general broad sanctions. And the ones I really am against are broad economic sanctions that hit everything. But I think also there are various curbs and restrictions that can hurt the generals and not, to almost not be aimed directly at hitting the economy. So I really wanted to make the distinction there. But yes, in answer to that question, I think the West clearly has to do something. And what that something is, I mean, we'll see a range. It's like what New Zealand did. But if you listen to New Zealand's wording was very careful. It was like they are cutting all high-level contacts with political, I think it was high-level political and military contacts. Well, what Western country isn't at this point? And they also, the more important thing was they said they do not recognize the legitimacy of this regime. So they spelt that out, and countries could do that. And then probably sanction individuals, probably the whole. Anyway, there's an endless array of tools at disposal, I think.
Great. So this is fascinating. It's something that I wanted to get into, but one of the viewers has asked a good question. How will the coup affect the border regions and the different ethnicities of Myanmar that have been marginalized? I know that there's been fighting and so forth, and I think, Tony, this is something that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I can make a broad brush sort of answer to that question. If you're talking ethnic armed groups, you're talking essentially two categories. One category which signed the nationwide ceasefire agreement in 2015 and 2018. That's 10 groups. And on the other side, you've got groups which did not sign the NCA and remain outside of it. And that group is mainly based in the north. It's led by the United Wa State Army, which is very close to China. And it's a 7-party alliance, which comprises probably 70 to 80% of Myanmar's fighting or potentially fighting insurgents. So you have two clear-cut groups there. The response to the coup has been very different. The signatories, those who have signed the NCA, have come out and effectively embraced the Tatmadaws' willingness to continue to talk on the basis of the NCA. The FPNCC, that's the group up in the north under Wa leadership, had an emergency meeting 2 days after the coup and very significantly did not release any statement either endorsing the coup or criticizing the coup. And the way I read that is fairly simple. I think that given the relationship between the Wa, who lead this group, and the People's Republic of China, it was suggested to the Wa that this would be the best way to go. For the moment, don't commit either to being against the coup or supporting it. So you have a very different array of forces there. But I think, or of attitudes towards the coup rather. But I think the important thing to understand is that from the Tatmadaws' position, it is critical that until the situation in the Burma heartland, central Myanmar, has been stabilized and is secure, it is absolutely critical that they maintain ceasefires with the ethnic groups. And at the moment, there seems no reason to believe that that wish on the part of the Tatmadaw cannot be fulfilled.
Right. Koei, you were going to add.
I'd just like to add, along the Thai-Myanmar border, the situation is stable. We are much more worried about human smuggling of the labor who have not gone through the diplomatic channel because of the fear of COVID. There is fear, of course, in the future, if there is some movement amongst the armed minority groups along the border, it could cause the military of the Tatmadaw to start some retaliation. But at the moment, as Anthony pointed out, there's no reason to do so. If that happened, it could bring pressure to bear on the, not only on Thai Myanmar border, but on other borders with other countries, including China. So I think the situation now along the border is quite stable.
Can I just add to that very quickly on that? Actually, if you notice in the junta's communications, it was the first thing they said after announcing their coup was to put the peace process top of the agenda. It was absolutely the top. They clearly feel that this is one area they can make a difference where Aung San Suu Kyi failed. I mean, frankly, the peace process is in tatters. It's gone nowhere. It's chaotic. Most of the groups don't like dealing with the structure that she set up. The talks have not been successful. And actually, talking to some of the people involved in ethnic groups and dealing with them as well, is that there is a perception that the military gets things done. You deal directly. That a lot of well-meaning civilian negotiators in the structure that Aung San Suu Kyi set up were not really part of the, were not really peace negotiators and became such. So I think that's interesting that they feel that could be a quick win where they could sort out some peace agreement and hold that up as a measure of success. I mean, they might be completely wrong, but it was interesting the focus they're putting on that.
There's an interesting question here about whether there's some impact of what's happening in Yangon and whether that has some impact to the political issues in Thailand. And this kind of triggered a thought that I was trying to, I was rolling around in my own head, where is the military looking to Thailand as a model, given that they've had a history of coups and military involvement in the government and so forth? Is there, I mean, is that a model to follow, do you think? In Koei, it looks like you had a
no. Thailand is a very bad model to follow.
I wasn't saying it was a good one. I was just wondering if it was one.
I don't know. They've stayed around, Koei.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
they've stayed around.
Myanmar Tatmadaws is different from the Thai. They fought for independence. They are really hard work, so it's different. So I don't think they will follow the Thai model, but certainly there are certain lessons they can learn. You know, how to approach the international community, how to deal with political party. That thing, I think there are some lessons, but Thai Tatmadaw and Myanmar Tatmadaw are two different things. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Well, yeah, sorry, go
on. So we have another one that's, we've talked about this a little bit, but the question is, after tasting social and economic gains in the last 10 years, is there now a chance that you could have some defection in the military or police personnel? This is something we touched on before, but the questioner is putting it in the context of economic gains in recent years.
I'm not quite following what the link would be with economic gains and defections. Meaning what?
The quality of life has gone up in the country.
And
sorry,
therefore,
what did you say, Chris?
That the social and economic gains in the country in recent years has would give some people a feeling that that this should continue. You know, people within the police or the military to feel.
Oh, I see. That might entice them to
exactly.
To think,
yes.
oh, you know, regardless whether they like the NLD or not,
exactly.
They can see that the economy is improving, so they want to keep that on track.
Yes.
Wow, that's an interesting question.
It's an interesting question. We've got great questions from the audience.
Well, I'm the one who brought up the possible defection theory. Tony has poo-pooed it entirely. So I would just say, if anyone was going to defect, and watching the expressions of the police defections, several of them were caught on camera, and they were fascinating to watch the expressions, especially of the police at the barricades, just before they removed the barricade to let protesters through. You could see they were absolutely solid and they were doing their job, and then their faces kind of changed, and then they looked at each other, and then one moved the barricade and they all went. So right. I think actually there's the main motivation for a defection would be actually just that deep down feeling that it's the right thing to do. I think the economic gains would be part of that, and they could see that. I mean, they've all seen how the country has opened up. I started covering Myanmar in 2010, and I can tell you it was in the dark ages. I mean, I got a taxi it took ages to get a taxi, and the floor was rusted, and my foot went through the hole in the floor, and that was the smartest taxi in the queue. So, you know, things have really changed, and I think they all know that. But if there was any possibility of defection, it would be this idea of the people's will the voices on the street and doing the right thing. That would be my sense if it happened at all. But we should talk a bit about the economy, and that's the other thing that the military is under huge pressure. I mean, the pandemic, Myanmar got hit very badly by a second COVID-19 wave. The lockdown has been really harsh, and Thompson, you should say something about that because you've lived through it. But the economic growth forecast has gone from there. It was supposed to have 7% growth nearly this year, and that's been reduced to less than 1.8%. And actually, I think it's going south. It would be lucky to stay in positive territory. What's happened even up to now, but with the coup, I think it's going to go into negative territory. So that's a real consideration that puts the military under pressure.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting note that we should hit before we close. Thompson, I think hearing about Gwen's foot going through the floor of the taxi, I mean, do you, when you talk to people on the streets, what do they feel is at risk for them now? I mean, what is their sense of what they've gained that they don't want to lose now? What I guess ultimately I'm asking what's bringing them out into the streets, but I'm talking about the economic gains.
Sure. Well, of course, I mean, we talked about freedom. That's one thing. But economically, I touched upon earlier on how the disruption to transport, government policy like curfews and ban on public gatherings, as well as the internet, have severely affected a lot of businesses, big and small. I think, there's a service provider I talked to, a small one, local one, who said she was really frustrated in the way that they have took down mobile network. She said it's impossible to get anything done. So I think if this goes on, that would really weigh on how businesses work here. I think the other point I would add here is it is interesting to note how quickly some of the business leaders, led by the UMFCCI, the country's top business body, met Myo Aung Hlaing, according to state media, including lots of local tycoons and local bankers. And I think what I've heard from both local protesters, but also foreign executives, is there is a reputational risk and a political risk for anybody who are seen as early adopters of the new military junta regime. And in terms of domestic risk of domestic backlash and boycotting their businesses, but also amongst foreign governments and the international community who would put in a colonialist or visa ban like before.
I guess nobody wants to be the next Kieran, right? They had a rough time.
Exactly.
Kelly, you've got a...
Just a short comment. I think Myanmar is a country of young people. The biggest loss of this coup is that the opportunity for the young people to go out and compete with the rest of ASEAN, which have enjoyed great opportunity. I think this is the most important part for me, having living in Myanmar. Thank you.
That's
and if I can, on this question of the mentality of the protesters now, yes, you're seeing a lot of them on the streets are young. I mean, my God, only every fourth one is wearing a mask at all. And but you can bet that all their families feel similarly. And I think several have said to me, it is now or never.
Wow. Right. Well, we're almost out of time. Tony, I think you had your hand up for a point. Maybe we were still talking about the police.
We can go back to that if you want, Chris, but I think we sort of moved beyond that into the area of sanctions. So I don't think there's no real point in going back.
Okay, great. Well, we've got 1 minute left. I just would like to say thanks to all of you. Thanks very much. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thompson, I'm just kind of in awe that you were able to find an internet connection so quickly. That's just amazing and shows the resourcefulness that we've seen in your reporting over the last few weeks. So thank you all very much. And I'd like to remind the viewers to keep up with our reporting on Myanmar. We're doing a live blog that we're updating all the time, and we're really putting out a great deal of coverage. I believe Gwen's got a big story coming out in a day or two.
Oh no, I think it's on Monday, Chris.
Oh, okay.
It's on Monday.
She's just gotten an extension on the deadline. Sorry, Gwen, didn't mean to give you a heart attack. Okay. Well, that's all.
We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
Anyway,
I'm in trouble. So
thanks to all the panelists. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, everyone, and
Bye.
have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye, chat.
Thanks for watching. Bye.
Thank you.